Alright, we're going to review operations with radical expressions. Whoop. And we've learned that just like with polynomial expressions, we can add, subtract, multiply, and divide radical expressions. We can use all properties like associative, distributive, and commutative with the radical expressions. So for example, radical 3 plus 2 radical 3 are like expressions because the radicand is a 3 in both of those terms, and so they can be added. 1 of this animal plus 2 of this animal is equal to 3 of that same animal. Whereas something like radical 15s plus radical s are not like terms. We can't combine them farther because the 15s is not like the s under the radical sign. Sometimes we've been asked to simplify terms that are not like radical expressions, but we can do some simplifying and then eventually combine them. So for example, 4 radical 7 plus a 4 radical 28. As they stand right now, they are not like expressions, and so we can't combine them. However, we should notice that 28 has a perfect square factor of 4 in it. So I will rewrite this as 4 radical 7 plus 4 times radical 4 times radical 7. So the square root of 4 is 2. So this simplifies to 4 times 2 radical 7. We now have like radical expressions that we can add together. 4 radical 7 plus 8 radical 7 is 12 radical 7. Let's review the distributive property with radical expressions. Oops. So, for example, if we have radical 2 times the binomial radical 6 plus 5. Just like we use a distributive property with real numbers, we can distribute this radical 2 to each of the terms within the parentheses. So this becomes radical 2 times radical 6 plus the 5 times the radical 2. We can multiply radicand by radicand, and that makes this radical 12 plus 5 radical 2. The coefficient needs to remain outside of the radical sign here. Radical 12 has a perfect square factor of 4 in it, so I'm going to simplify that to radical 4 times radical 3 plus 5 radical 2. Square root of 4 is 2, so my final answer is 2 radical 3 plus 5 radical 2. I can't do anything more because my radicands are not the same, so I have unlike terms. And then finally a review of FOIL with radical expressions. If I wanted to multiply radical 6 minus 2 radical 3 times 4 radical 3 plus 3 radical 6, I can use FOIL just as I did with a binomial times a binomial. So my first terms would be a radical 6 times a 4 radical 3 Then my outer terms, radical 6 times a 3 radical 6. Inner terms, negative 2 radical 3 times 4 radical 3. And then finally my last terms, negative 2 radical 3 times 3 radical 6. And what you're going to notice is the product of the first terms and the product of the last terms will tend to be like radical expressions, and the two middle terms, the outer product and the inner product, will end up being perfect squares, so we'll be able to simplify that. So radical 6 times 4 radical 3, we have to keep the coefficient outside of the radical sign, and then we can multiply radicand by radicand. So 4 radical 18 plus radical 6 times 3 radical 6, keep the coefficient outside of the radicand, and radicand times radicand is 36, plus coefficient by coefficient, negative 2 times 4 is a negative 8, and inside the radical, 3 times 3, or 9. And then finally, my last product, negative 2 times negative 3, which is coefficient by coefficient, is negative 6, and then 3 times 6 is 18. So you see in these middle two terms we have some perfect squares with the 36 and the 9, and the first and the last term are like radical expressions of 18. Radical 18 can get simplified. We have a perfect square factor of 9, and so radical 9 times radical 2 plus, now square root of 36 is 6, so it becomes 3 times 6 plus a negative 8 times square root of 9 is 3, and then plus, again, radical 18 can simplify to radical 9 times radical 2. Last step, 4 times square root of 9 is 3, so 4 times 3 radical 2 plus 18 minus 24 minus 6 times 3 radical 2. Let's combine our like terms. Here we have a 12 radical 2 that's going to be like our last term over here, which is 18 radical 2. Those two can get combined, and then my middle terms are both constants, so these guys will get combined. 18 minus 24 is a negative 6. 12 radical 2 minus 18 radical 2 is a negative 6 radical 2, so my final answer is negative 6 radical 2 minus 6. Alright, and we're going to learn on the next video how to use FOIL along with a special binomial called a conjugate in order to rationalize radical expressions.